The air raid sirens dotted around the neighbouring districts had suddenly blared into life. Something of an air of resignation had taken hold of the residents that dwelt there. It was an experience to which they had by now become wearily accustomed, with the number of both practice drills and genuine air raids steadily increasing in frequency. But however helpless the inhabitants of the city may have felt, their situation was, in reality, far worse than they could imagine. Weeks before, all of their anti-aircraft defences had been quietly removed by the authorities, relocated eastwards in a vain attempt to hold back the marauding Soviet Air Force. As a consequence, when the first RAF aircraft were detected approaching from the west, their only opposition was a solitary Luftwaffe squadron. But even this offered no real protection to the doomed city. Already operating at half strength due to losses sustained in recent engagements, its few remaining aircraft were chronically short of fuel. Of the 6 Bf-109s that did rise into the sky to face the oncoming horde, 2 would turn away due to mechanical failure. None of the remainder would engage the enemy for more than 15 minutes before they too retired. As a consequence, the lead squadron of British aircraft arrived over their target unmolested, proceeding to unload a seemingly unending curtain of coloured flares and target markers. For the few citizens still unfortunate or foolhardy enough to have not yet sought shelter, it was as if daylight had unexpectedly returned to the skies above them. A sea of flaming beacons slowly descended down onto the buildings below, continuing to burn brightly out into the darkness, even after they made contact with the ground. Minutes later, the RAF mosquitoes that had dropped this beautiful, yet deadly ordnance veered away, keenly aware that to linger any further placed them directly in the bombing path of the wave following behind them. Their way now clear, the 250 Lancaster bombers of the main bombing group made their final approach, bomb doors opening, in readiness to unleash hell upon the people of Dresden. It had taken Ralph Kohler and his neighbours several minutes to force open the doors to the cellar that they had been sheltered in, the entranceway partially blocked by shattered rubble and masonry. Advising them to stay put, and that help would be on the way, in the full knowledge it would not, the police inspector pulled his overcoat higher to his waist and hurried out into the destruction. The other survivors had pleaded with him to stay, fearful that the lull in the bombing was deceptive, expecting that yet more enemy forces would soon arrive in the skies above them. Had his wife still been alive and amongst their number, the policeman might well have paused to consider such an act, keen that if his final moments were to come, he would share them with her. But the deaths of their 2 sons had proven too great a burden for her to bear, their eldest having been lost early on during the conflict, commanding a U-boat in the North Sea. Following that tragedy, she had pleaded with their surviving son to desert from the Panzer battalion he had been posted to flee and to hide from the coming battles. But the boy had refused, determined to avenge his brother and to defend his parents from Germany's enemies. Then he too was gone, along with countless other sons and brothers, amidst the madness of Stalingrad. Trying to push the lingering pain of the memories away, Kohler laboured on through the shattered surroundings, previous experiences during the Great War gently desensitising him to the scenes playing out around him. Some of the bodies he passed lying out in the streets were naked, their clothes having been burned away or physically blasted from their bodies by the force of a detonation. Others were barely recognisable as the people they had once been, what little remained of them having been broken apart and grotesquely integrated into the shattered and broken streets they died in. Finally, he arrived at the police station, heartened to see that by some miracle it had remained largely intact. Around him, many of his officers were now also assembling, desperate for direction. As reports flooded in about damage to various sites around the city, Kohler began to dispatch his men to assist the fire brigade in their rescue efforts. At the city's train station, almost 3,000 lay dead or dying. The initial victims had been killed by the remains of the building's vast glass ceiling, as it had shattered and fallen down upon them. But many more had gone on to be crushed to death, as panicked survivors tried to flee down the station's ornate staircases, away from the horrors, into the claustrophobic tunnels below. Elsewhere, all of those who had sought shelter in a local church had been burned to death, the thick stone walls converting the building into a grotesque form of oven. Being located in the far eastern side of the country, Dresden had been largely untouched by previous bombing raids, which had led many there to mistakenly believe the British would never allow their bombs to fall on such a holy city. In a bitter irony, the firemen were supported in their work by Allied prisoners of war, some being the former colleagues of the very bomber crews who had just unleashed this nightmare down upon them. Kohler had been updating a map of the damage caused to the city when he became aware of a commotion. Turning, he saw two soldiers bedecked in immaculate black uniforms striding purposely through the chaos towards him. With so few of their number still remaining in the city, he immediately recognised them as the adjutants of Hauptsturmführer rank, his opposite number in the SS. The inspector found himself being bluntly ordered to hand his duties over to a subordinate and to instead accompany them. It was a demand he immediately refused. It was not until one of the pair produced a sidearm, informing him of the immediate and fatal consequences of such a reply, that he eventually relented. The flaming and broken ruins which the soldiers ushered Kohler through were barely recognisable as the picturesque streets they had once been. During the journey, they had passed by countless wounded citizens whose pleas for help were cruelly ignored by the SS pair who ushered the policemen on past them. As they progressed deeper into the carnage, Kohler was acutely aware that various fires around the city were gradually starting to expand and gravitate towards one another. The air around them was becoming increasingly hot and difficult to inhale, and the asphalt beneath their feet seemed to be growing noticeably in temperature. Almost immediately, their progress began to slow, the streets ahead filling with dazed and anguished survivors who had now emerged from their hiding places. As a consequence, a walk that should have taken a matter of minutes instead took closer to an hour. All the while, the soldiers shouting and threatening anybody who approached them. Finally, not far from the smoking ruins of the Continental Hotel, commandeered some years ago to act as a base of operations for the Gestapo, stood Wenck. The SS captain was visibly agitated, pacing up and down, demanding answers from a band of civilians who had been herded before him, which included several children. Lying in the centre of the square behind him, amidst several piles of loose rubble, a lone body could be seen, laid out beneath a grimy and blood-stained sheet. Barely able to hide his contempt, Kohler walked directly past the officer, refusing any form of pleasantry, before lifting the sheet in an effort to find out why he had been summoned. But he could barely hide his shock and surprise at the lifeless face of the corpse that stared back, that of Dr. Rudolf Kaltenbrunner, the former head of the city council. Swatting away the hand that had been clamped down on his shoulder in an effort to force his attention, Kohler demanded to know why he had pulled away from the rescue effort for the death of one old man. The SS captain quickly turned a shade of crimson, incredulous that the inspector might not be concerned about the murder of one of the city's most prominent citizens. Kohler began to laugh, almost uncontrollably, gesturing to the chaos around them. Would the captain perhaps like him to sail to England and arrest the pilots of the bombers who had killed the good doctor? Refusing to respond, Wenck pointed to the nearby throng of terrified citizens, motioning for one of them to approach. Moments later, a young boy dressed in the dusty and tattered uniform of the Hitler Youth meekly stepped forward. With Wenck watching on, the boy described to the inspector how he had refused to seek shelter despite the direction of the police, as he had been distracted by the dazzling effect of the target markers being dropped. When the first bombs had started to descend from the heavens, the youth had turned and run as fast as his legs would carry him, finally diving for cover through the open doors of a nearby cellar. It was from here, as he had stared out in a mixture of awe and fear, he had caught sight of a lone figure, hurrying directly into the centre of the nearby square. Illuminated by the explosions and detonations falling around him, the boy had watched on as the old man stumbled and fell, wildly looking around himself in abject terror. And then, another shadow had emerged from the darkness behind the man, a huge hulking outline, only recognisable as a living being in that it was moving around amidst the chaos that surrounded it. With growing horror, the boy had watched on as this giant figure bent over the fallen man, repeatedly striking away at him with impossibly huge arms, seemingly ignorant to the bombs that were falling around them. There had been a sudden and blinding flash, a nearby gas main rupturing and catching light as it was struck. When the dazzling glare had finally cleared, neither figure was now visible. Continuing to ignore Wenck's prattling beside him, Kohler gazed down into the eyes of the youth that stood before him. For the briefest of moments, it was as if one of his sons were once again stood before him, confessing to some youthful transgression. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, thanking him for his time and ordering him to seek shelter, before returning to assess Kaltenbrunner's body. The former politician's remains were remarkably intact, compared to others that lay around the perimeter of the square. They were completely untouched by fire or smoke, but quite badly battered and bruised. Behind him, Wenck was explaining how the body had been found half buried under the rubble when it was found, and some had been cleared away in an effort to try and save the doctor. Taking a closer look at the debris, Kohler found himself frowning. The colour of the stone and brick here was markedly different to the ground around it, and there appeared to be smaller, lighter pieces of stone also scattered around. Kohler had bent down to retrieve several fragments of this pale stone when a series of mournful wails suddenly erupted nearby. He quickly recognised the sounds as hand-operated sirens, only used by the wardens as a backup in the event the main alarm network had failed. For a moment, none of the people standing in the square could believe it. Surely no reasonable enemy would follow up such devastation with yet another attack so soon. Then one of Wenck's men came running across the square, screaming that more Allied bombers were approaching, and panic took hold. As people ran for cover in all directions, the policeman reluctantly fell in behind the SS men, realising he had little option but to seek shelter alongside them. The second wave of Lancasters that approached the city were twice the number of their predecessors, and this time needed no flares or markers to locate their target. Dresden already lay in ruins below them, raging fires spreading rapidly from street to street, consuming buildings and people alike as they merged together. Even so high above the madness, the bomber crews could not ignore the destruction. The temperature inside their fuselages visibly increasing from the fires below, and the scale of the destruction moving many to tears. In aircraft around the formation, crews began to plead with their pilots, begging they drop their bombs off target, away from the city centre, in an effort to spare those below them. In many cases, the pilots agreed, but this attempt at mercy instead only served to increase the number of deaths, their bombs now falling into the suburbs that had previously escaped the attack before. At the city zoo, keepers watched on in horror as their animals were quickly consumed by fires, the unfortunate beasts screaming pitifully until they finally succumbed to the flames. In the nearby Great Garden, several thousand people who had sought refuge from the fires in this large open space now found themselves completely at the mercy of the enemy bombers. As the crowd turned and began to run, a deadly mixture of incendiary and high explosive ordnance fell amongst them, sending groups of bodies flying in all directions. At various locations in the city, the union of several raging fires began to exert a curious vortex effect, sucking up the bodies of the living and dead alike, sending them spiralling up into the sky. Throughout this, Kohler remained far beneath the madness, in a military bunker, surrounded by soldiers and city officials. The only signs he could feel of the Allied raid were the distant thumps of the bombs exploding, but he knew that with each detonation, more death and destruction was taking place to the people above him. By the dim glow of the shelter's lighting, and as those around him laughed and joked about how safe they were from the bombers, he stared down at the rubble he had retrieved from the ground around the doctor's body. With its smooth and polished surface, it was almost unmistakable as marble or a similar material. Here and there were also what appeared to be the edges of dark lettering that had once been carved deep into its surface. He reflected that Kaltenbrunner could perhaps have been carrying some kind of memento or valuable item on his person when he fell, or perhaps he had been caught by flying debris from a nearby building. It was not unheard of for people hiding in shelters to be driven mad by the deafening bomb blasts around them, causing them to completely lose their minds and run wildly into the devastation. And yet, no explanation sat comfortably with the police officer, particularly when given the clear conviction with which the only witness had seen the doctor's death. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the incessant crump of the overhead detonations ceased, and the doors to the bunker were opened. Cautiously, those inside stepped out into the night time to discover that now even less of their home remained unmolested by the enemy attack. Over half the city was now ablaze, illuminating the remainder as if it were the height of day. Worse still, Many of the fire crews who had been fighting the flames had failed to find shelter ahead of the second wave, and now lay dead amongst the ruins. For a few minutes, like the others around him, Kohler was struck dumb, almost unable to process what had happened to his home in such a short space of time. But then, something deep inside him, placed there by his previous military experiences, kicked in. Removing his overcoat, he walked over to a ruptured water main, soaking the garment as much as he could. Pulling the sopping item back over the rest of his clothes, he then silently slipped away from the soldiers and councilmen, making his way back in the direction of the police station. Dawn was just breaking when Venk's men finally located Kohler again. He had spent several hours outside what remained of his workplace, noting down reports from each district and sending men to help out wherever they were most needed. This time, he did not argue when they ordered him to come with them, reasoning to do so would only waste even more of his time. Better to simply accompany them and then return to his duties again as soon as possible. Their journey was quicker now, perhaps because there were less survivors to stand in their way, or merely that what few there were now too frightened to come out following the second attack. With a growing sense of realization, Kohler deduced that the damaged house he was now being led towards belonged to Venk's immediate superior, Henrik Becker. It would transpire, however, the head of Dresden's military authorities was not in residence at his home address that morning. Instead, Captain Venk was once again impatiently awaiting him, with a lady he recognized from previous meetings as Frau Becker. The SS Major's wife tearfully explained that she and her husband had returned to their home from the shelter after the first bombing, in the belief they were now safe. When the second raid had begun, Becker ordered her to join him in the cellar, confident they could wait out the destruction due to the building's strong foundations. The married couple had sat alone in candlelight as the fury of the Allied attack played out around them, only to freeze in terror as they heard the doors to their home being smashed inwards above them. The couple had stared at one another in growing horror as they realized they could hear heavy footfalls sounding on the ceiling as someone noisily progressed through their house. The cellar door had suddenly splintered inwards, a huge shadow falling across the hallway outside. With a cry, the Major had produced his pistol and fired repeatedly at the intruder. Frau Becker had watched on in fright as a giant looming shape had stepped into their cellar, having to stoop down low as it was too tall for the cramped and confined space. As the candles around her quickly blew out, she caught a glimpse of a featureless behemoth reaching for her husband, illuminated in the strobe-like flashes from the muzzle of his weapon. Then a huge limb grasped the Major, crushing the gun and every bone in his hand with it, before violently yanking him clear out of the safe space. At this point, the terrified woman broke down, unable to complete her story. Kohler looked ponderously across at Venk, who silently motioned for him to follow. There, 2 streets down from the address, they found the body of Maya Becker. It lay spread-eagled out in the open, impaled on the remains of a splintered telegraph pole, staring sightlessly up into the dawn sky. Moving closer to the corpse, Kohler saw that here too, the rubble and debris lying around the base of the pole were curiously darker in colour compared to the rest of the ground. He knelt down, running his hand through the loose brick, and produced more of the smooth white stone fragments he had uncovered lying next to Kaltenbrunner. Ignoring Venk's demands to know what it was he had found, the inspector quickly began to head back to the police station, determined to interpret the cause of the 2 men's deaths. Pulling the remains of a desk from inside the shattered building, Kohler emptied the contents of his jacket pocket onto the wooden surface and began to move the stone fragments around, as if they were the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Here and there, the edges of a letter or the beginnings of a word began to form. After several minutes of effort, the inspector understood that what he was looking at was some form of inscription, carved out in Hebrew. He realized he had seen these words, and the stone they were carved into, many years before, hanging on a wall within the city's synagogue. But that building had been razed to the ground, amidst a fit of political madness during the winter of 1938, by a crazed socialist mob. Kohler had the briefest of warnings of Venk's approach from one of his men, before the SS officer materialized from the ruins, now flanked by a number of Volkssturm soldiers. The men he had managed to assemble were all the city had left to defend itself, and they were a sorry sight. Old men and children, in ill-fitting uniforms, their features weary and tired. As his eyes scanned their number, Kohler was disheartened to see the same boy he had interviewed at the city square, wide-eyed and terrified by the situation he had now been thrust into. Marching up to the desk, Venk stared down in puzzlement at the assembled stone pieces and demanded to know their significance. He listened as Kohler explained how they had been found at the locations of both deaths, and they appeared to have originated from the long-destroyed Holy Temple. With his words coming to an end, Kohler watched on as the colour completely faded from the captain's face. Both men were recalling the night the synagogue had burned down, and the trio of Nazi officials who had ordered that it be set light to. Of those 3 men, 2 now lay murdered within the city's decimated landscape. The other stood paralysed to the spot in fear. Swallowing hard, the SS man demanded to know what Kohler believed was taking place. The policeman remained silent for a second before he shared his thoughts with his opposite number. Somebody appeared to be using the bombing raids as a cover to kill the men who had destroyed the synagogue, leaving the stone pieces behind them when their work was done. With a shrill cry, Venk drew his pistol and screamed at the detective to follow him. He turned and stalked across to the soldiers, berating them for their bedraggled appearance, ordering them to stand to attention. His voice was shrill and shaky as he had half shrieked his orders. They were to fall in and accompany him to the synagogue ruins, where they would locate and apprehend the killer of Major Becker and Dr. Kaltenbrunner. As the soldiers slowly began to comply, Kohler stepped forward, taking hold of the boy in the youth uniform, swiftly removing the Luger from his belt in the same movement. In stern words, he ordered the lad to run home as quickly as he could, take off the uniform, and flee the city with whatever members of his family remained. The child needed no second request, sprinting away off into the ruins. Kohler looked up, to be met with a stare of unhidden loathing from Venk's eyes. He returned it, his own gaze conveying how little he cared anymore for the SS man's authority, before he shoved the pistol deep down into his coat pocket and set off after the departing soldiers. The Semper Synagogue had been amongst the most beautiful buildings in Dresden. Despite being relatively modest in design, its interior had been decorated in a rich and ornate style, attracting visitors from far and wide. But all that changed with the rapid rise of National Socialism. At Adolf Hitler's insistence, and as part of a nationwide purge of the Jewish faith, his acolytes in Dresden had been ordered to destroy the building. One bitterly cold November evening, a group of armed militia under the command of Becker and Venk had been directed to attend the site, in company with Herr Kaltenbrunner. Ralph Kohler had also been present that evening alongside his officers, ensuring that no elements of the congregation attempted to impede the destruction of their place of worship. But there had been no disorder. Even then, before their numbers were so brutally decimated, the city's Jewish population had never posed any threat to the wider community. The destruction of the synagogue, whilst the local police stood by and allowed the socialists to carry out their act, marked the start of the nightmare for Dresden's Jews. The 200 or so still remaining 7 years later had been forced from their own homes into cramped and dilapidated apartments. They were denied the right to work for pay, prevented from using public transport, and refused the ability to purchase goods from shops. Kohler knew the names and faces of every one of these poor souls, as they were required to attend the station on a regular basis to acquire various permits and passes now forced upon them. The idea that one of their number could be a murderer was a nonsense to him. Most were old or infirm, with a few left of younger age relatively sick or disabled as a result of years of illness and neglect. As he and the soldiers approached the synagogue ruins, he could not ignore the irony that the rest of the city had ultimately gone the same way as this tragic building. He watched on as Venk directed the soldiers into the ruins at gunpoint, displaying a clear lack of military understanding as he did so. There was no effort to coordinate their movements, or to establish firing positions, or a perimeter. They were simply shoved and herded, as this man had pushed around every other person he had come across in his life. Kohler paused to take one final look around him before he followed them inside. Only the skeleton of his city now remained, a smoking mass of twisted steel and rubble, still violently ablaze in many places. With a heavy sigh and an even heavier heart, He picked his way across the cratered street and passed into the ruins of the Holy Temple. The girl had made no effort to hide herself and was seated directly in the centre of where the main hall had once been, apparently awaiting their arrival. Kohler recognised in the moment he saw her. If she was Jewish, she and her loved ones had done a remarkable fact of hiding the revelation from those who had hunted them. He remembered her name to be Magda, or something close to that, and she was employed at the city's train station. Several years prior, she'd been brought into the station for questioning, suspected of assisting Jewish refugees fleeing the city by illegally obtaining tickets. After her interview, when his officers had left the room to make inquiries, the inspector had warned the girl of the danger she could be placed in, advising her to stop whatever it was she had been doing. For a moment, Kohler couldn't decide who possessed the most hatred in their eyes, her or the SS man. She remained seated, staring up at Wenck in open defiance as he raged over her. The captain had just informed her that she was to be taken to the courthouse and guillotined without trial, when she silently rose to her feet. Ignoring the pistol that had been levelled at her, the girl reached deep into her coat pocket before scattering several objects onto the ground in front of her. Peering across the room, Kohler realised the fallen items were more pieces of the marble tablet he had recovered from the two crime scenes. A growing feeling of dread suddenly rose up inside the policeman as the girl began to speak in Hebrew. Wenck yelled at her to stop, again waving the pistol, but this had no effect. There was a cry of fear from one of the elderly soldiers as a series of small stones began to inexplicably roll into the centre of the room from the outside edges. Several larger pieces of masonry suddenly cracked and broke away from the shattered walls, joining the growing flood of rock and rubble making its way towards the girl. As those inside watched on in disbelief, these pieces began to press together, interweaving, locking. A large humanoid form slowly became visible, rising up between the girl and her aggressors. With a terrified scream, Wenck fell backwards, imploring the soldiers around him to open fire. Several of these men immediately complied, the Mausers they held kicking and barking in reply. Kohler watched on as the bullets they fired ricocheted harmlessly off the hulking stone entity that now stood before them. Amidst the deafening noise of the rifle fire, he saw the girl motion towards the soldiers with her hand, the imposing guardian responding with a slow, ponderous movement. The towering monster that was under the girl's control took several lumbering paces, its steps noisily echoing around the ruined building as it did so. It lashed out, the terrifying blow completely shattering the bones of the first soldier it reached, sending his body crumpling to the floor like a limp rag doll. The girl followed the creature's progress with her outstretched hand, still reciting whatever reading or curse she was speaking as it moved on to its next victim. Swatting away the man's rifle, the monster smashed down hard with both arms, pulverising its hapless victim. Then it turned, moved onwards to another target by its youthful master. Across the room, having realised how futile engaging this monstrosity was with his rifle, one of the old soldiers frantically plucked a stick grenade from his belt and tossed it. The potato masher detonated, instantly killing two soldiers stood near it, but also knocking apart the monster. As large chunks of rock and stone tumbled to the ground, several of the men let out a wild cry. Moments later, these cheers died in their throats, the creature slowly reassembling itself again into a larger and somehow more terrifying form. It lumbered across the room towards the soldier who had thrown the grenade, seizing him roughly and tearing the arm that had thrown the explosive completely free from the torso. Kohler caught sight of Wenck, still lying on the ground, raising his pistol to shoot the girl. It was an act he never achieved. 2 rounds from the gun held by the inspector, smashing into his shoulder. Suddenly there was a new sound, flooding into the room from the streets outside. Yet more enemy bombers were approaching the city from the west, air raid sirens sounding for a third and final time. As the few remaining Volkssturm fled the ruined room, the girl turned to look at Kohler. He slowly lowered the gun, placing it back into his pocket, and then opened his palms wide to show he meant no harm. Wenck was pleading now, apologising to the girl for whatever wrong he had done her, claiming he had been forced into his actions under the threat of imprisonment and death from his superiors. He begged to be allowed to go, to seek shelter from the coming bombers, trying to rise to his feet, whilst at the same time staunching the blood that flowed from his shoulder. The girl waved her hand, still chanting emotionlessly as she stared down upon the pitiful SS man with loathing and disgust. Moments later, 2 great stone hands came crashing down upon him, utterly crushing his skull. As explosions started to sound around them, drawing ever nearer and nearer to the ruins they stood in, the girl turned to look back at Kohler, and then the monster lumbered forwards. The pilots of the 300 American B-17s that now approached the city had been issued with orders to target the train terminus and the shunting yards. Their task was made difficult, though, by a near impenetrable plume of black smoke that covered the district as a result of the previous British bombing raids. As a consequence, many bombs fell wide of their target, raining one final round of destruction down upon the hapless citizens of this dying city. Many refused to seek shelter, ignoring this third wave of bombers, their minds still unable to comprehend the hell that was being visited down upon them. When the explosions finally ceased, and the drone of the huge wave of enemy bombers died away, all was still within the shattered synagogue. After a few minutes, there was movement, Kohler struggling to free himself from underneath the remains of the stone monster. As the nightmarish creature had towered above him, arms raised high above its head, he had looked into the eyes of the girl expecting to see hatred. Instead, he saw nothing. Her features had been blank and expressionless, as if all emotion had long since been burned out from behind them. At the same time as the first bomb exploded inside the ruins, the monster had stretched itself out to cover the falling policeman. He had lain still beneath it, as various explosions detonated around them, before the deafening noise of the bombs had finally ceased. When that happened, the being above him had crumbled apart, covering him in its remains. Dusting the last of the rubble from his jacket, he rose and looked around the room for other survivors, but there were none. The girl lay a short distance away, crushed by a wall that had collapsed inwards under the force of the bombs. Whatever power she had used to create the stone monster had clearly died with her. Kohler stared, and then turned to look at Benk's ruined remains, trying to comprehend the madness of the situation he had experienced. But ultimately, all of this was of little consequence when compared to the horror the city itself had suffered. The only thing he had left to cling to was his duty to his people. Little else mattered. He reached into his pocket for the boy's gun, tossing it to one side. But ignoring the aches and pains that protested inside his body, the inspector wearily made his way outside and into the depths of his shattered city.